So the Germans are known for their productivity and efficiency, but honestly, I think they're pretty overrated in that regard, especially when you start to consider their insane bureaucracy. And for that reason, I'm going to be, what's this? Oh, culture group tier list in EU4. Ah, okay, one second. Right then, cultures, and more specifically culture groups in EU4. There's a bunch of them, and it's time to rank them in the only objective way possible, a tier list. For the rankings, the main things we are considering is how much development do you get to accept for free when you become an empire with them, as well as any culture-specific reforms you gain access to. This conversation naturally takes them to a somewhat disclaimer-based section. If you have someone with, say, German culture, is Prussian-specific mechanics a part of that for the rankings? Like, you need German culture to access that, but playing as, for example, Austria means that you are German culture, but you can't use those mechanics. So for me personally, and this will be rather subjective, it's going to depend on the culture. For example, English has some neat reforms you need to unlock when you're playing as GB, and those reforms are pretty good. Since most games played as an English culture involved you forming GB, I think it's fair to look at that as a buff to specifically the English culture group. However, let's now take a look at something like the German group. Being Prussian culture again gives you access to cool Prussian mechanics. But if you're playing Bavaria, you're not going to be using them, hence I won't include the Prussia possibility in the rankings. Basically, is there an alternative within the culture group that lets you not use those mechanics for most of your games? With that said, that's about it. So to clarify, I picked the best national flag I could think of for each culture group. And if you don't know what culture group that is, stick around for the video and hear me say it. Otherwise, I like to be appreciated if you haven't already, and a sub would be amazing. But with all that said and done, let's go. We start today with the Australian culture group, or more specifically, the Aboriginal culture group. I've got the Australian flag going for them here, but that's about that. So in terms of unique reforms, you don't get anything, which is quite sad to be honest. I think that could have been a relatively easy way to give them a bit more flavour. But I think their main flavour comes from their religions and relatively interesting mission tree. It's not that unique within each mission tree, but there's some stuff going on there, so that's kind of all you're really getting. The development isn't great, but hey, it's if you get all of Australia. It's basically just bad overall, but at least there's some things going for them in terms of the culture group, because, well, you get the Australians. It's not as bad as some Native American ones, and boy, they're a lot better than Native American ones. But for me, it's not going to get anywhere above the E tier. With that said, after Aboriginal, we move on to the Altaic, one of the three Horde culture groups. In terms of unique reforms, you do get access to a +1 leader siege and -10 artillery cost reform at the military tier, which actually, honestly, is pretty good. A leader siege pip is quite hard to come by, and I think that's a pretty nice buff to get. And artillery cost is also quite nice as a specific thing, because usually when you're not specifically stacking something like artillery cost in your run, or reinforcement costs or whatever, artillery tends to be quite expensive. It's a premium thing to have in your army, so making that cheaper, I think, is quite good. And hence, I think is honestly pretty underrated as a cost reduction. You do get access to a pretty decent chunk of development with that culture group. This is one of the three Mongols after all. And the land that you do have is steppe, which means that if you do decide to reform into something that doesn't have the... Well, if you decide to reform into something which has access to the Cossacks estate, it's going to be quite nice land for you to dev. And even without it, it's not bad land as well. So it's a lot of land, it's not high dev land, but it's good potential land. You're playing as a horde, you do get access to some relatively nice reforms. For me, it's a pretty solid culture group. There are certainly better culture groups out there, but it's going to be going very comfortably into A tier in my opinion. With that, we move on to our next culture group, the Andean. And now we enter Native America. Who doesn't love Native Americans? Oh god. There's so many Native American culture groups. There's one thing that Paradox communicated well within their culture groups is the diversity of the cultures inside Native America. The problem, of course, is that by adding so much diversity within the culture groups, it makes each individual culture group be quite weak compared to just culturally assimilating, going ham on the continent. You don't get a lot of development with it. The thing is with the Andean group is it's just not great the development you do have access to. There's some okay great projects. I think that's something I didn't mention in the disclaimers, is I guess access to great projects, but nothing to really stand out that much, and a lot of them are religiously tied anyway. It's not the worst Native American culture group, because at least there's some starting development compared to some basically migratory tribes with 3 development, or 6 if you've been really lucky in a forest. So I think they make their way into E tier, but that's me being extra generous because of just how completely awful a lot of the other culture groups are. I still wouldn't exactly recommend playing as them, but hey, there's some campaigns you can do with them, so hey, you can enjoy that. With that said, we move on to Carpathian. Oh god, even Paradox didn't have a real flag set for them. So I've found this one on the internet, I think it looks cool. With that said, I mean, there are a couple of tag-specific flags, I'll use them later, but for this one, I thought, yeah, let's find another cooler-looking flag, and now you can't read it, so sorry about that, but it is what it is. There's a lot of things into this tier list, and a lot of them are quite small. With that said, no unique reforms, terrible land, terrible small culture, it's an awful culture to play as. Just straight into F tier, and guess what? There's going to be a lot of natives with this one. And the next native we're taking a look at is going to be, of course, Arusian, Arayusenian. There we go, close enough. The relatively famous option here is the Mapuche. There's three other tags that, well, three other cultures that don't even have a tag on them. So I've obviously went with the Mapuche flag on them. It's, again, the same problem. No development, no unique stuff. We move on. After that, we go to the Arido-Americans. There's a bit more dev at least going for them, but again, no unique reforms, no unique content, just complete sadness for everyone involved. And so I think it's going to be not a surprise where they're going to join in F tier. General tip, if you're in the Native American, if you're a Native American culture group, there's going to be very little development for you, there's going to be very little content for you. You're probably going to be going into F tier unless you something like the Aztecs. With that said, now we move on to the Baltic group, that's the Estonian, Lithuanians, and that area. Well, it's not inherently awful. Unfortunately, again, with the Baltic, you don't get any unique government reforms that require to be specifically Baltic, unless you play something like the Livonian Order, but then it's about the Livonian Order. For most of the Baltic group tags, they do have unique stuff, so it kind of makes up for the lack of culture-specific things. Lithuania has unique Lithuanian governments and missions. Same can be said for the Livonian Order, and I mean, Estonia is at least relatively an Easter egg as a tag. You don't exactly see it in most games, if you see it at all, so it's not really a big complaint against it. With that said, one of the other things that's really holding this culture group back is there's just not a lot of things. There's not a lot of development inside the area, and the highest dev city inside of you is Riga, and that's German. So, while it's better than Australian, because at least there's development in at least a reasonably desired amount of area, so, you're not exactly in the crux of Europe, you're still within the domain of Europe, and the development's not awful, so I think D tier is pretty reasonable to put it up, but I can't see it going further than that. With that, we move on to the British culture group. God, is it awful. I mean, one of the accepted tags you get in the British culture group is you get England, that's the big one. But the thing is with getting England is you can just accept the English culture with anyone else. You get the Welsh, which is 4 provinces, great. Half those provinces are 3 development, the other half is 5, so it's pretty easy to culture convert. And you get Cornwall. Great, it's literally a 3 dev single culture. What an amazing level of acceptance. Didn't pick up some of the Scottish. The thing is about the Scottish culture is not even all of Scotland is Scottish. It's just pathetically small. Now, of course, the problem is that the actual England unique, formables, especially now with domination and the previous Rule Britannia missions, is really strong. And the English culture itself is relatively concentrated high dev in really good land on the English channel, so it's got a lot of going for it in terms of just England itself. My issue with it is that a lot of the power from England comes from the GV formable, which is something we discussed earlier, and I think it's reasonable to include it, because if you're ever playing around as England as your primary culture for the Empire thing, you're probably playing as England. And with England, you get your land to develop is really nice. There's a lot of grassland, and more importantly, there's a lot of farmland. There's a lot going for you as England. So I think it's pretty reasonable, honestly, to put them into B tier. If they just had more things to accept, they would be going a lot higher, but they really, really don't. So yeah, that's, I think, a pretty reasonable placement for them to be in. With that said, we move on from the British onto the Burman culture groups. That's a relatively fun one. Now, so the Burma people, well, the development is nice. You also get some relatively nice reforms. There's a reinforcement cost reform that you can get on your military tab. And when you're at war, you can get 20% manpower recovery speed and -10 regiment cost, which is nice. And if it's a defensive war, you pick up an extra 10% more manpower recovery, so you recover 30% manpower if you're in a defensive war. And you get some fort defense, and more importantly, you get 7.5% morale of armies. Meaning that that's quite a nice reform to pick up, to be honest. Furthermore, in terms of your normal reforms, when you're just in that culture group, you get 10% manpower, which is okay. but you also get 10% construction cost, which is really nice for your early scaling. And considering it's a relatively early reform, I think that needs to be mentioned, it's quite a nice thing to pick up. You also, with that reform, have a weird mechanic where every time you build a barracks, you gain 1k flat manpower, and every time you build a dock, you gain 200 sailors. Very gimmicky, it's very hard to time it, but I guess it can be useful and should be mentioned. So it's not inherently awful as a culture group, but it's not great. Minus 10% construction cost isn't enough to make up for it, and there's just a lot of better, there's a lot of better cultures in the area. It's not that big considering the size of the culture groups around it for me. And so, yeah, I mean, it's definitely not a bad one, but I think we have our first C tier. So with that said, we move on to the next person on our list. And that is, of course, going to be the Byzantine culture group. And I put the Greek flag for that, because I knew that if I had to put the Byzantine flag and someone saw Byzantine flag in a low tier, they're going to be mad. Unfortunately, the Byzantine culture group is terrible. It is just terrible, I'm sorry. You get Greek culture group, which has the same problem as England. It's a decent culture group, but you could just accept it if you're someone else. Otherwise, you get no unique reforms, which, well, sucks for the most part. I mean, if you're playing as Byzantium, you get Byzantine autocracy and then the Byzantine stuff, but that's very Byzantine missions. The weird thing with Byzantium is even though, well, a lot of your culture group, you think you're playing as specifically Byzantium, there are achievements and there are reasons to play Theodoro and Trebizond, all those things. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of the requirements for the Byzantine culture group aren't actually be Byzantine culture group, it's be Byzantium, which takes away even the argument that, oh, the culture group is better because it has access to it. No, it's not even a culture-specific thing, it's literally a Byzantium-specific tag thing. And unlike England, where you can reasonably argue that you're only ever playing England to, well, get access to the GB missions or whatever. With Greek culture group, you're only ever being Greek primary culture. You are being a Byzantine primary culture if you're playing something like Theodoro or things of that nature. So with that said, I think they're just terrible because realistically you just accept Greek and the rest you culture convert. So even though it's relatively reasonable real estate, it's just not a good culture group. It's not going to make it past E tier, I'm afraid. With that said, we get back to our favorite categories. More people in Native America. Three pathetic tribes. Caddo. I know Caddo memes. Caddo is strong. Caddo is overpowered, but no, Caddo sucks. It's terrible. Especially with a lot of their minimum strategies nerfed. It's going straight into F tier. And again, Carib, I'm not going to repeat myself. You've got the memo. It's a terrible Native American culture group. It's an F tier. There's not much to say there. No unique content, not much unique after that. With that said, we move on to Carpathian. It's a weird culture group because you'd think you can just accept the Hungarians and you'd have most of that culture groups sorted. Unfortunately, not really. Romanian is a relatively big culture group and so is Transylvanian, and a lot of the Romanian Transylvanian land is actually good land you want to be deving. So being Hungarian means you don't have to bother about accepting it. It's a pretty pathetic culture group, I'll be honest with that regard. But it does make up for it by at least having some unique reforms that are tied to specifically being Carpathian. Well, not really. I mean, unless you're more specifically, they're tied to being Hungarian cultures, so you can get the Hungarian missions, to rephrase. But I'm going to argue that most of the time when you're playing Carpathians, you are playing Hungary. This is different if you ever are playing Romania campaigns, but I don't think they happen as much as people like to think they do. Most Carpathian primary culture campaigns, you are playing as Hungary, within the same domain as England. Like, there's going to be some Welsh nationalists playing England releasing players Wales never formed GB. What's the Welsh national things? Cymru Urae, I think, or whatever the hell they're calling. I've definitely butchered that. So thankfully, however, Welsh people haven't discovered the internet, so shouldn't be able to call me out on that. With that said, when it comes to playing as Romania or something of that sort, I can't really bully them too much. Unfortunately, Romania has really good internet. So with that said, yeah, I mean, unless you're in a Romania campaign with Carpathia, I think it's pretty reasonable to say you're getting access to a lot of the Hungarian missions. So I think that's enough to knock them up for like Black Army reforms and some other unique stuff with that. And the land is in a pretty good space. You're in Europe, and it's good land to dev as well. Hungary's pretty good land to dev. So in my opinion, it does do quite a bit better than the Estonian one, but just barely. I think it enters C tier pretty reasonably without much complaint. With that, we move on to the Caucasus. Basically, Armenia. Armenia gameplay, Georgia gameplay, that kind of stuff. You get a slightly better defensive fort reform if you're playing as them, which kind of plays well around the Armenian missions and the Georgian missions, which is nice. And I mean, it helps because you have a lot of people on your border that want to invade you. But it's not that big of a culture group. And the land is, at best, okay to develop. Like, it's just not awful to develop. It's not tropical or anything, but it's just hills and mountains, which I mean can be nice, but it's just not great. The trade goods are surprisingly okay. There's some silks and stuff, so the land is, I think, at best okay. And the buff you get in your unique government reform isn't really enough for me to justify anything past D tier. So I'm going to put in them in D tier, and I think that's a relatively reasonable one, but yeah. There we go. With that, we move on to the Celtic culture group. Oh, Christ alive, this culture is awful. It's just bad. You get Irish, and you get half of Scotland. It's somehow worse than the English culture group, which is impressive, because that culture group sucks in terms of who you're accepting. And it's not like you have good missions. The Scottish missions are basically a minor power missions, nothing to go home about, and the same can be said for the Irish missions. Both of those tags, you're just better off forming GB, which you end up doing anyway. So, right? It's just, they're just bad. Like, honestly, the Celtic culture group sucks. You get a unique government reform, at least for Tanistry, which isn't strong, it's just some unique flavor, but it's kind of like an elected monarchy, so if you really want to abuse it, it's there, but it's more of like a glorified elected monarchy. If you really want to bias Tanistry, just pick a different elected monarchy in a more relevant part of the world. It's just bad. It's not as bad as Native Americans, but it's not going to go past E tier. And with that said, after the Celtic, we move on to Central Algonquian. Algonquian? Algonquin. I'm just going to stop talking, honestly. This is not going well for me. At least it's reasonably sized, namely there's 7 whole cultures inside of them. Unfortunately, all 7 of those cultures are basically Native Americans 3 dev provinces that get culture converted when a European arrives. So again, it's an F tier. It's just bad. No unique reforms. And with that, we move on to Central Americans. Aztecs are fun. At least the cultures you accept now have a bunch of gold mines on them, so I think with that you can at least make up for it somewhat by the land being relatively small, but at least good. You get gold mines, you get some nice stuff with it related to it, and hey, there's a lot more unique stuff going for it. Honestly, it's going to be relatively high praise coming from a Native American tag, but I think Aztecs are pretty much on par with the Inca in terms of at least having a bit of their unique stuff going for them in terms of access to monuments as well. So I think they claw their way into E tier, but I'm not going to go past that. With the Aztecs done for your Central Americans, we move on to Central Indian. Now, Central Indian has some reforms going for them, I believe. Let me double check that in my notes. They don't, my bad. But the thing is with Central Indian is at least the dev is there, right? This Central Indian reform specifically is a bit sad in terms of what culture groups you get access to. You get Garjati, Gondi, and Yakarandi, so you get at least 3 Indian cultures. The thing is with India, it's flooded with development, and I mean the later other Indian tanks, I do know for certain they get some unique reforms. With these guys, it's a bit whatever, and actually I think with Central Indian we have to clarify one very important thing in terms of reform access to. I believe their culture reforms aren't actually tied to specifically the culture, but more of having a capital within an India region, or something similar regarding to that. So you do get a bunch of relatively unique reforms. Nothing too spectacular, like one of the later ones for Southern Indian, which get access to, for example, 10% ICA in their reforms, which is quite nice, but still, you do get some like Indian Sultanate stuff, which I think deserves a mention. And even though it's only 3 culture groups, the 3 culture groups you do accept tend to be relatively reasonably devved. With that said, that's a lot of words for basically not a great culture group, so into E tier they go. You're not a Native American, you're not doing a lot better than that. After that, of course, we move on to another 3-cultured migratory Native American. Yeah, these guys suck. More specifically, this is the Chibchan people, but again, I've definitely absolutely demolished the pronunciation of that. My apologies, but hey, I don't know how Native American pronunciations work. I don't know how most pronunciation works. After all, I believe, a self-professed YouTuber. I'm not meant to be able to pronounce anything. It's a miracle that I got as far as I did. With that said, in terms of miracles of as far as I got, we now move on to the Chinese culture group. Now I want to make one thing very clear here, and one thing very specifically. I am critiquing the Chinese people. More specifically, I'm critiquing the Chinese culture and the way of life. I'm not critiquing their government, okay? Have we made that absolutely clear? Excellent, alright. Now, with that said, and before I get cancelled by everyone on every side, I mean, hey, sounds like a fun activity. The Chinese culture group is actually absolutely amazing. Jesus Christ, this thing is good. Now, they get like a whole bunch of unique reforms. Let's talk about. Well, let's address the elephant in the room in a bit. They get a relatively decent chunk of unique reforms. One of them does suck. The examination system is bad. You should never run the examination system. The Chinese examination system is awful and should just be avoided at all costs, to be honest. With that said, it's the rest of the reforms are quite doable and unique. You can get some fort defense shenanigans stacking if you take some of the other reforms. And the big thing that we have to address is just how much development you get with China, right? Starting development of the Chinese culture group is insane. You are literally if you're playing as main, you are great power number 1, simply because of the level of starting development you get, and you have 3 times the highest sync of the next person with 25% autonomy in every province, right? And on top of that, you can do a bunch of Sinicizations to get Sino-Tibetan, Sino-Vietnamese, and Sino-Korean shenanigans going, because apparently Chinese culture group needed to go even larger, so you can grab a whole bunch more land on top of that. And on top of starting with an obscene amount of development, loads of your land is farmland. Loads of your land is grassland. It is beautiful to dev China. China is incredibly developable. It is just beautiful land, great trade goods because you are, again, China. So you have just so much things going for you. Chinese culture, like, unironically, is definitely amazing. It is the definition of a top-tier culture group, honestly. So for that reason, I think Chinese culture clear S tier. There's very little debate about that. With that said, we move on to, well, Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is, the Kushite culture group more specifically, not the Ethiopian. Doesn't actually have anything unique tied to it, but most of the time when you are playing as Kushite, you're playing as Ethiopian. I kind of gave it away there. You're doing a campaign in that regard. Sometimes I think Adal I've seen being played, but no, don't tell me you go and open a game of EU4 and go, you know what? I want to play Ausa. I want to play Medri Bar. No one does that, okay? If you're playing in the area, you're playing Ethiopia. Sometimes you're even going Jewish. Ethiopia has a lot of cool stuff going for it, so I'm going to make the case that because it's a Ethiopian culture group, you pick up some relatively unique stuff from it, so I'm going to judge that in the regards of including the Ethiopian buffs as well, and those are pretty good. They've definitely been power creeped a lot in the recent updates, but there's a bunch of unique cool monuments in that area as well that do require the culture, so I think with that said, the development's okay, you accept a decent chunk of people, but it's not great, so I think C tier is about as far as I'll go with it. After Kushite, we move, Kushitic? Yeah, Ethiopian. We move on to the Dravidian culture group. There's cool stuff in here. So let's first of all address the reforms. You get access to 100% vassal force contribution, 15% national manpower modifier. That is really good. Vassal force contribution, if you ever go colonial or vassal builds, is really strong. And you do pick it up if you're Dravidian. Technically, Orion and Sinhalese also pick it up if they are, so it's kind of half of a different culture group, but that's only half the start. You also gain access to empowering the polygars. Other people in the Indian tech group also can get access to this. Well, sorry, the Orion and Sinhalese that I previously mentioned. But you get dev costs, which is good, and ICA on it, so it's just a very, very nice reform to get as early on as you do get it. So again, empower the polygars, I think really keeps it up there as well. There's also diplomatic free policy if you're Muslim, instead of empowering the polygars, which can be pretty good as well. Diplomatic policies are probably one of the worst policies to get somewhat tied. Well, it depends on they're the worst because I think in multiplayer, I'd say military policies are the best ones, and then admin second best, and diplomatic policies are the worst ones. And in single player, I think admin policies are the best, mil policies are second best, and diplomatic are the worst. Unless you're doing a specific build, in which case, with this one, you are getting the worst kind of free policy, but it's still the free policy that can be pretty strong. So I think that's something to be considered, and hey, so an option. Furthermore, you can also pick up a -10 fort maintenance and 100% governing capacity reform. It's very nice if you are playing around late game stuff, because GovCap is always good. It's more states to have. And fort maintenance really adds up when you're going for a wide empire, because you can have a lot of forts to defend it. So it synergizes really well with itself, basically, because it's good when you have a large empire, and it's good when you have a large empire. So if you have a large empire, it's just good twice over. You're going to get a decent amount of money saving for fort maintenance, and you get a bunch of GovCap, so nothing to complain about there. And finally, if you are Muslim, the Muslim equivalent of the GovCap, 100 GovCap flat, is -20 state maintenance. You should never pick this up, it's state maintenance. if you own the entire universe and you have... Sorry, if you own the entire planet, let's not talk about universe or conquest, this isn't Stellaris. You're probably going to pay, what, like 100 ducats if you're running some, expensive state edicts or state maintenance. You're going to save, like, what, 20 ducats in a world conquest? And realistically, for most campaigns, you're not paying more than 10 ducats in state maintenance. Like, France, I think, pays something like 3 ducats at the game start on state maintenance. State maintenance is a joke. Reducing it by 20% is pretty irrelevant, let's be honest. So, there we go. With that said, a lot of good dev there. So, I will take it. We also have the Dying Mines of Golconda. It's an Indian tech group. There's a lot of things going for you. I think it's definitely a very, very solid, culture group. So for me, it's going to be going into B tier. Not quite getting up there into the A tiers for me. I think there's some more, on average, solid groups, but a lot of things to go for it. So I think B tier is a pretty justified spot for it. With that said, we move on to East Bantu. For those that aren't aware what this is basically Kiowa. No unique reforms. It's a weird one, though, to put there, because, again, most of the time you're playing Kiowa. Mutapa's in their own culture group, so I think the argument can be mad for the Kiowa mechanics, and Kiowa does have some relatively nice stuff going for it, but it's also not great. I don't think there's that much going for Kiowa to really justify anything super high tier. There's some decent development. It's a decent trade node as well, which I think is important to mention. Zanzibar is a very nice trade node, so you're getting relatively premium real estate. But it's not amazing for deving, because even though it's relatively flat, it's pretty tropical, or tends to be, so... I think D tier is about the most I'll go for it. With that said, we move on to Eastern Algonquian. Yeah, great. It's another Native American. There's a bunch of them. The dev's pretty terrible. Into F tier we go. After that, we move on to the East Aryans. That's the Indian tech group. That's basically your Bengals, your Orissas, your Nepals. It's a lot of dev. It's Indian development, so it's good dev. It's not quite China in terms of how much dev you're getting, but it's good dev. And I think that's important to mention with that. So, yeah. I mean, just on the dev alone, the East Aryan is going up quite a bit. Unfortunately, past that, again, you get access to some unique India stuff, but... yeah, it's just you're just accepting a lot of people with this culture group. It depends really on the tank you're playing, because obviously Nepal and Bengal tend to be very different campaigns, those tend to be played as well, so yeah, that's another thing to be said. But in terms of pure dev you're accepting, it's India. There's a lot of dev here, and I think that basically puts it up there with the Indians in terms of just how much dev you're grabbing for free with that. So, now that we're talking about free dev, we get onto the East Slavic culture group. This culture group's a monster. So it used to be really good, because a lot of the land you're getting with this is really good potential land for development. And even without that, there's just a lot of land here that's quite nice. That's your Ruthenians, your Belarusians, your Muscovites, Novgorodians again, and Ryazan. It's just good land to grab. The thing is now, Russia got a whole bunch of buffs of domination, and Russia is a monster in terms of just their power from their missions and a lot of their buffs they get. It's incredibly powerful. And even your other side tags, you've got what? You've got Novgorod, which has their own mini version of the Russian mission tree, but Republic. You've got Ruthenia, or Kiev, or whatever you want to go with that tag. So Kiev that can form Ruthenia, which again has some pretty neat stuff going for it. You've got the, some pretty decent unique government reforms. And by decent, I mean, well, really strong stuff. You get access to the Boyars estate. You get access to principally the Russian principalities and Tsardom. Again, just really good reforms. Yeah, I mean, Boyar's military service for later is a monster. Vodka of the Crown is a 10% goods produced reform. It does come with +1 idea cost, but honestly, it's just good. And when you do pop it for Vodka of the Crown, when you get the additional decision from it, 125% production efficiency is really nice. So, yeah, just really good stuff all around on the reforms. And really to rub it in, East Slavic, when you are doing the Russian missions, you can merge that with a whole bunch of the other Slavic culture groups, and basically form this absolute monster of the United Slavic Culture Group, which includes all the Slavs apart from Albania for some reason, but whatever. Anyway, it just kind of leaves Albania in their own little one-tag culture group, which is really funny. But with that said, yeah, the East Slavic Culture Group, absolute monster, really strong culture group. It's no China, but it's very much knocking on their doors, and is pretty comparable. So I think just so we have to set aside that China's still a step above of the game is better, I think East Slavic can definitely go into A tier, because there is quite a bit of work you need to do to get towards things like the Slavic Culture Group, and it's not every campaign you do it, if you are playing the Ruthenia campaign, for example, but it's definitely deserving a slot in A tier. So with that said, we move on to the Escaluet. It's the Inuit Culture Group. There are no tags starting with this culture group. It's oh my god, it's literally the like native Northern Canadians. Canada's a meme because of how relatively weak it is out of every single colonial nation. And this tag, this culture group doesn't even have any starting tags there. That's how pathetic it is. I mean, honestly, I was tempted to, as a joke, make a unique culture, make a unique tier just for it with how bad it is. But you know what? Congrats. I didn't bother to do that, so you can make your way into F tier. You can fail because of my laziness. Congratulations. That's the best way of summarizing this culture group. God, it's awful. Even by the standards of Native Americans, somehow going below. And the worst part is, because there's no tags that have this primary culture group, I had to actually Google their flag, and this is what Wikipedia gave me, so I'm using that, but yeah, God. It's awful. So with that, then, we move on to the Evenki culture group. You get Janzhao. You get, it's like a mini Horde one. But it's a relatively bad Horde ones. There are better Horde culture groups. Janzhao is doing a lot of heavy lifting, though, for that culture group. That's kind of the TLDR there. Janzhao is keeping it relatively relevant, but past that, it's pretty bad, to be honest. There are just better Hordes out there. So because of the better Hordes out there, I can't really justify anything above a D tier. But we have to acknowledge that, hey, at least it's relatively nice because you do get access to those Hordes over there, and there's a decent amount of development, especially in an area that does need development, Horde land, because Hordes are very reliant on conquering development, whether it's from other Hordes or other civilized countries. And unlike Native American potential development, this potential development is just go conquer another Horde nation instead of wait 100 years for some colonizer to arrive and colonize it. With that said, we move on to the French culture group. Yeah, it's good. It's just good. Most of the time you're doing this as France, so you there's an argument to be picked up there for the French missions. If you're not, you're doing this as Burgundy, which again also has good missions and unique content from that. Nice government reforms, a lot of development you're accepting, just honestly a very nice culture group all around. Not as good as something like the English around them. Sorry, a lot better than English around them in terms of the cultures you're accepting, and when you are playing as France, you get to conquer the English so you can accept them, if it's a single-player game, of course. So, yeah, a lot of very nice expansion opportunities within the French culture group, and you're sitting on very premium real estate. You're pretty much smack bang in the middle of Europe, as close as you get without being in Germany, and we'll get to the Germans in a minute. And again, nice government reforms, a lot of stuff going for you. Not quite as good as the Chinese in terms of development, but a lot of really good land, a lot of really good development, a lot of nice stuff. A tier for sure, not much more to talk about then. With that, though, we move on to the German culture group. Oh god, the Germans are good. They are probably sitting on the best real estate in the game, because even though it's not ideal to dev, it's still good to dev. It's relatively forested, but it's not that bad, because there's still a decent chunk of grasslands and farmland in there. But Germans start dev. Because Germans start in the Holy Roman Empire with all their little HRE, little OPMs running around, they all run around with one very important thing, their own mana pool. So they're all going to be putting a lot of them into Germany. And unless you're doing something like a 1515 conquest of Germany, well, even then, there's still a decent chunk of time for the AI to get their dev clicks in. So Germany just ends up being really devved. So taking the entire German culture group, you're taking an obscene amount of development in basically the best real estate in the entire game. Europe, right? It is a monstrous culture group. It is genuinely up there with the Chinese, I think, without a doubt, with just how much development you're getting. And in terms of unique content, you have the Austrian unique content, which is a lot of stuff there. Incredibly powerful, arguably one of the strongest, if not the strongest tags in the game. I'm still of the belief in single player that Austria is not the best tag for a world conquest. I believe that title is still held by the Mughals. But the fact it's debatable just goes to show how strong Austria is. Their PU shenanigans are out of this world, and again, they're German. However, you also get access to the Prussia stuff. Again, that's a whole different kind of worms, which is just how incredible that is. And even your other stuff, like your Switzerlands, your Westphalias, your Hanovers, and even the Netherlands. Again, so much good stuff. So much great land that you're accepting. Netherlands are beautiful to develop. Just, again, an excellent culture group. Loads of unique content, loads of unique powerful content. We have our second S tier. And with that, we move on to the Great Lakes culture group. Oh god, it's terrible. It's 3 cultures. It's 3 pretty gad cultures in Central Africa. I mean, it's around Lake Victoria. That's cool, right? That means something. Woo, yeah, no. No real unique culture reforms that come from being specifically, well, the Great Lakes culture group. There are some like fetishist unique reforms you get access to, but that's up to their religion or to their culture. It's not Native American. The problem is it's not significantly better than Native American. You're better off being most other cultures, so on it, I can't justify being above an F tier. It's probably the best F tier, which is why I'm putting it at the top. I'd still probably play them over playing as a Native American, but the fact I'm comparing you to a Native American should tell you all you need to know. With that said, we move on to Hindustani. Well, unlike the other Indian culture group that we talked about, well, we talked about two of them. Unlike the this one here in E tier, it's a lot more unique. It's a lot more development than you're accepting, and again, relatively good land. The trade goods in India are very, very good. You also get access to the Mansabdari system, which is, I mean, it's a thing. You do get the nobility estate and the Mansabar cavalry force military service rule privilege shenanigans, which is nice. And also, you can get it if you're the Mughals. But in terms of the reforms, you get a nobility max privilege, which is nice for the Mansabar cavalry force and that kind of stuff. You want to play around with it. But I think the big one there is minus 50% war taxes cost. You can combine it with another reform later on, I believe, to get minus 100% war taxes cost and free war taxes. It's basically minus 15% land maintenance when you're at war. And that can save you a pretty decent chunk of money. Pretty decent chunk of change, can't complain. Although I believe that this reform is actually the same tier as the default minus 50% war exhaustion. Minus 50% war taxes cost. No, it's not. That's an economic reform later. So no, it's good. We'll recommend you grab it. If you are playing inside the Hindustani culture group, or you're playing as the Mughals, it's a nice one. Although I think the Mughals have a better one because the Mughals are Mughals. But with that said, it's a nice reform to like even out your relatively decent chunk of development you're getting, and you're getting a very nice chunk of development. I find Hindustani culture, so your Delhis, your Punjabs, those kind of tags are the ones that go ahead and actually form India a lot of the time when you're playing them as well, which I think is worth a mention. So while they're not quite as insane as something like the French culture group, I think they also, much like Delhi, sit very comfortably in B tier, probably near the top of them. With that, we move on to the Iberian culture group. A lot of unique mechanics. For example, establishing orders is actually tied to being Iberian and not being Sunni, so that's just good. Iberian culture group is very nice in that regard. Castile has a lot of content. Portugal has a lot of content. Navarre has a lot of content. Basically, every single tag inside the Iberian culture group has a lot of content, unless you're talking about the Brazilian tags. But again, as colonial nations, I'm not going to hold back Castile gameplay and Iberian gameplay just because Brazil exists. With that said, again, you also get a pretty decent chunk of development. Inside, I won't say as good as the French development is. It's not that premium real estate, but you're still in Europe, and it's still relatively good land to dev. You're starting to get a lot more area to development now, but we're not exactly in the tropical area, so again, it's still pretty decent devable land. And on top of the Holy Order mechanics, you do get access to the tercios. Now, Castile has a better version of the tercio access reform, which gives you a bit more access to ratios, but even if you're playing someone like Lyon, you can still establish the tercios and have fun with those. So with that said, it's a pretty solid culture group. I don't think it's as good as the French options and certain things later, but it can definitely make it into B tier as well. Good land, good stuff, good things all around. But with that, we move on to the Iranian culture group. Yeah, it's good. Most of the time when you're playing the Iranian culture group, you're either going into the Mughal kind of campaign because you're playing something like Afghanistan or Ardalan or something like that, or you go into the Persia route. The other option nowadays is also QQ into like a mini settled horde campaign. So even though that avoids a lot of the Persia buffs, QQ has a lot of cool things going for them and hence should be mentioned. It's incredibly good land to just own because Persia trade node is really, really good. The trade goods are amazing, very much on par with India, and you get to suck Indian trade as well, which is really good to have. Again, it's a very, very good culture group. You accept a lot of development, and there's a lot of really, really strong content around it. Praise is all around for this culture group, which means I think they are very deserving of the A slot. Not quite as insane as something like the Chinese slots, but still pretty solid and can hold up pretty well on their own. So with that said, we then move on to, well, actually we would move on to the Iroquois culture group. And yes, oh, that is the Iroquois, I got confused, my bad. Yeah, it's Native America. There's, unlike the Iranian culture groups, we just gave heavy praises to, again, it's a sad culture. More Native Americans than F tier. Honestly, F tier is going to be looking very populated in this. With that said, we move on to Japan. The Japanese culture group. Now, this is another example of playing as England getting access to the Japan stuff. The Japan mission trees are really strong. You get a whole bunch of really unique, powerful stuff, and I think for that reason we have to respect it for not being that, like, not for being not as weak as they seem. There are still a couple Japan culture group exclusives for your reforms, like being your daimyos or whatever. So that definitely holds up. And the thing with the Japanese culture group that I think is quite interesting and should be mentioned is that even though there's basically two culture groups inside Japan, well, three technically, accepting them is usually worth it because they have a lot of depth between them. So if you are conquering Japan and you haven't enough slots to accept them, accepting the Japanese is a pretty good shout. And then you don't need that many culture groups. Unlike something like England where you just need the one slot to accept the entirety of Japan, you do need three, which is worth mentioning. But it's a pretty good investment because the development you do get there is pretty big. So playing as Japan, you also do save yourself three dev slots of three culture group acceptance slots of development. And I think they are really held up much a bit higher because of their unique missions. With that said, it's not as amazing as something like Persia or France, and it's still, at the end of the day, only three cultures. So I cannot justify anything above a B tier, I'm afraid. After that, we move on to the J culture group. It's Native South America. It's awful. It's F tier. There we go. F tier is growing larger. And to no surprise, we move on. After that, we go to the Kamchatkan culture group. And it's going to be basically another... I mean, you play Ainu for a challenge in Japan. Otherwise, it's just tanked. I think that's kind of the good summary of that culture group. Yeah, there we go. It sucks. After that, we get into the Congo. Now, if the Great Lakes were terrible in terms of lack of content, the Congo and the Congolese culture group actually has a decent chunk of stuff going for it. Most of the time when you're playing them, you play as Congo. I haven't really seen anyone play as Lunda or Luba or whatever. But if you do play as them, most of the time you are playing them to from the Congo anyway. So I think including the Congo buffs inside that list is worth it. Congo has some pretty cool buffs and a relatively fun and unique campaign, which is again relatively strong. You accept a decent chunk of people within the Congolese culture group, so I think that's another thing that's going for it, which I think is important to mention because again, it's basically just the amount of development you're getting there is pretty decent, and it's not actually bad land to dev as well. So it's nice. Unlike the Great Lakes one as well, definitely, well, I think the land is pretty comparable, just with the Congo you're getting more of it, and I think that's worth a mention. So with that said, in terms of placements, well, they're definitely going above Great Lakes, but I mean, that's just saying they're going above FT, and that's not really saying much. I honestly think just because of how good the Congo is in terms of their missions and relatively uniqueness of the campaign and relative strength as well, where the Congo can really utilize fetishes to a lot of its potential. For example, it can even play around denying, Renaissance spawns if you're playing as Congo or going ahead to form the Congo and getting some pretty decent end of the game buffs. I think they're pretty decently high enough to sit in C tier, but I can't justify anything above that. So I think in par of Ethiopia and Hungary as a culture group is pretty fair, and Burma, but I'm not putting them above that. So with the Congo done, we move on to Korea. Now, when you're playing as Korean culture group, you're playing as Korea, and there's one big thing in the Korean culture group that kind of saves you from a terrible ranking. That is that you can sign asides and join the Chinese culture group, which by extension makes you amazing. However, you don't have to do that, and unlike the Chinese culture group, which just starts amazing, you do have to spend quite a bit of effort on doing that, so it's a much more potential. But incredible power, incredible government reforms, incredibly strong mission tree, really good to land to dev, so farmlands and grasslands all over the country. You get really good governing reform, you get really good reforms for specifically deving, and you get to join the Chinese culture group later. Again, you have to really work to use the buffs from this mission tree, from this culture group, unlike Chinese or German, where you just get them for basically existing. But for me, they are really an A tier. Now, if the Koreans could not join the Sino-Chinese culture group, I'd honestly probably knock them down to as far as C tier, because it's a very great culture group to just accept once and move on with your life. You basically get an entire Korean empire's worth of culture group by just accepting Korean. But because you can synthesize, I think that's a decent spot to put you into C tier, into A tier. After that, we move on to the Latin culture group. Now, the Latin culture group is basically your Venetians, Italians. So I have basically your Italians, I have the Venetian flag here selected for them. With that said, they're getting a lot of new content in the next DLC, but they are really good dev. They have the same thing going for them as the Germans. there's a lot of countries there that are going to be dev clicking for you. And it's really good land as well. It's sitting on 2 endnodes, which granted Venice isn't the best endnode out there, but it's still an endnode and that should be mentioned. It's a very rich land, it's a very good land to conquer, very AE heavy, but still just very good land to have, and there's a whole bunch of unique content going around in that area. For me, for that reason, Venice is going to be sitting very comfortably in B tier. Well, more specifically, the Italians are going to be sitting very comfortably in B tier. Then the Venetian flag is what I meant, as a pretty good culture group. But after the Italian culture group, we move on to the Levantine culture group. That's your Ottomans, that's your Syrians, there's your Omans and Mamluks and those things. Most people in there, after the latest DLC, have really good stuff going for them. So not just the Ottomans, but basically everyone else under them. It's also a really big culture group, especially when you do include the Ottoman culture in that. The Ottomans should really not be in this culture group, but I think they were added to this culture group because the Ottomans tend to expand into this area, so it's kind of a soft buff to the Ottomans to make up for the fact that this is their almost core lands to some extent. But what that has meant is there's a lot of development inside this culture group. Pretty comparable to the German development, honestly, but not that great. And the land, not as amazing as the German or Chinese culture group, and the land is great to dev, and there's a lot of unique stuff for them. Again, it's a very strong culture group, and I'm putting them up there with up there in A tier where they belong to. After that, we move on to the, well, Moroccan culture group. More specifically, though, if we're doing the ideal tier list, I'd mention the lost cultures here, because again, in alphabetical order. However, they don't exist unless you reform the Roman Empire, in which case, congrats, you're in the lost cultures. Yeah, I mean, you've reformed the Roman Empire, you probably don't care that much at this point. With that said, we move on to the Maghrebi culture groups. That's your Moroccans, your Algiers, Clements, and Tunis things. Relatively weak national ideas, and you don't get that much land to accept, but it's honestly okay. The reforms are... I'm not sure if the Maghrebi culture group actually gets unique reforms, or if it's more specifically the Moroccan things. No, the Barbary Iqta is a Maghreb specific, so I think it's fair to include them in that list. You get the ability to raid coasts, which is honestly pretty decent. Otherwise, not that much you get from it. And the Barbary Islet government is more of an Ottoman buff than anything, but hey, it does require you to be in the Maghrebi group. With that said, it's not great. Not great overall. You don't get access to that much culture, but at least got some relatively unique stuff going for it. I think, honestly, it's squeezing its way into D tier, because raiding coasts is relatively fun, and can definitely be strong when used, don't get me wrong, but it's going to struggle beyond that. So I think that's a relatively reasonable place to put it. And it's a pretty painful place to conquer, because there are culture groups all over the place, so it's not as easy as accepting one culture group. It is worth actually being that culture group in terms of culture acceptance. With that said, we move on to the past our Moroccan Maghrebi culture group, but on to the Malayan culture group. This land is, honestly, Malayan culture group, I think, is a sleeper culture group because it's really good. The trade goods in this area are really strong, so even though it's not cheap land to dev, when you do dev, the land that you've devved is very nice. It's very spread out on the islands, which makes it a bit more annoying, sure, than having a contiguous empire, but it's really strong. There's a whole bunch of unique stuff going for you there as well. It's pretty sleeper as a culture group as well. I don't think it's as strong as something like the Chinese or the Germans for sure, but you are on the Malaccan trade node. It's a really rich trade node. It's one of the reasons India's also quite rich, because they suck a lot of that trade node away from you. I mean, India's rich on its own, don't get me wrong, but it's also relatively culture united. You get a lot of cultures and you get a lot of land from this culture group. I think I'm going to be putting an A tier because I think it's honestly going to be deserving of that role. There's a lot of things going for the Majapahit, and more specifically the Malay culture group. I mean, again, you get the Spice Islands, you get the Cloves Islands, you get Malacca, you get, Majapahit, Brunei, and all those other pretty good lands as well. Just all around, a very underrated culture group in my opinion, overall. Now, after Malay, we move on to the Mandi culture group. That's your Mali, your Songhai, those kind of chaps. Over there, it's not bad. There's a bunch of gold in the area. The land isn't awful to death, but most of the time this land gets conquered by people that don't have the culture group spared to accept it. So it just kind of becomes trade companied, unaccepted land. Which isn't necessarily a bad insult to it, but it just means there's better things for you to accept, is the best way of describing it. When you're playing in the area, though, you do get a decent chunk of dev, a decent chunk of change in terms of your value from it. In terms of government reforms, yeah, unique ones. Let me check my notes. I don't think they have anything as specific to them, in fairness.
Ooh, wait, do they?
Am I being blind?
No, they do not. Sorry, my apologies. I'm misreading my own notes. But yeah, they don't get anything as specific to them. There's not actually that many gun reforms in that area. The DLC for them wasn't that generous with gun reforms when that came out. But it is what it is. You get some decent dev at the end of the day, and they're still gold mines. So it's definitely not awful simply because of its starting position. But in terms of unique content, I think it's lacking. So for that reason, it's going to be going into detail. After this,
we move on to the Maranon culture group.
You guessed it, Native American. Yep. And in terms of the next one is the Matacoan culture group. Literally no starting tags. It's completely awful. Again, if there was a unique tag for it, it'll be joining these guys over for just how awful it is. It's a South American tag. Paradox didn't have a flag for it. I googled it. Some random guy on Reddit made this flag, so we're going with it. I don't think they actually have a flag, or maybe they do have a flag. I don't know. In terms of finding their flag, I did around 3 minutes of research and found a Reddit post of some guy saying they made a flag for them. Province in Argentina, so I went with that flag. I mean, they have nothing going for them. They just have nothing going for them. So into that tier they go. After that, we get onto the Mayan culture group. A bit like the Aztecs and the Incans, they actually have some cool stuff going for them, and a decent chunk of development with some, relatively unique buildings. I think that's enough for them to squeeze into E tier, especially compared to just how much garbage there is in F tier. I think they do stand out above that, but not by much, to be honest. And I think they're the third relatively relevant tag to play inside the New World. So yeah, go for it. If you haven't tried a My campaign, definitely give it a go, especially the new DLC coming out. Try a pre-DLC My campaign, and then try a post-DLC My campaign. I mean, if you have spare time, of course, but I think they're relatively underrated, especially a lot of people playing either Aztecs or Inca in that area. I think Mayan and their Mayan Empire is relatively cool, and you get some, neat buildings from that. With that said, you do move on to the Khmer. That's your Khmer, Daiviet, those areas. It's a nice culture group to accept. I don't think they get that much unique stuff. There's relatively some great projects to pick up, but not too much things. So it's not great. The development is honestly quite comparable to something like the Ethiopian or Kilwan development. It's okay, and it's reasonable dev, but very tropical. So, I mean, I say it's reasonable. It's jungle tropical. It's not great amount of dev. It's just great. It's like reasonable only because the trade goods there tend to be okay. Honestly, I don't think it's even as good as something like the Estonian, because I think the great projects, while you do get 2, aren't unique enough or strong enough to make up for that. And there's not much going for you. You have no unique gun reforms as well. I think it's pretty top of E tier. It's definitely better than your Australian culture group. I think it's probably top of E tier, but I can't put it any higher than that. I feel like it's an insult to something like the Kilwan culture group to put it onto D tier. And I mean, again, the Greek culture group and those other contestants in D tier are really being carried by the fact they're in Europe, and Vietnam is very far away from Europe, I'm afraid. With that said, after we've bullied the Vietnamese, we move on to the Muscogen. That's your Cree, that's more Native Americans. I mean, it's bigger, but it's Native Americans. So even though, yes, you get like 3 more cultures than the average Native American, yes, still Native Americans, so those cultures have 9 development on it. Into F tier we go. After that, we get an awful Native American. The Native American on basically the Washington, the Pacific coast of America. Haida is the relatively famous tag there, and it's famous for being absolutely boring to play. It's also the only tag inside that culture group. It's awful. Memes aside, it's just awful. Into F tier we go. And after those guys, we get to the Nordic culture group. Now here I went for the Danish flag. Now you might be wondering why I didn't go for the Nordic Union flag or the Swedish flag. The answer is very simple. I wanted to bully Swedish people. Swedish people deserve a lot of bullying. If you meet a Swedish person, go bully them. This is not a harassment campaign. To be absolutely clear, I am joking. I have only saying that because I have a Swedish friend who watches my video. So if he does videos, so if you see it, hi. With that said, yeah, Nordic culture groups, it's actually pretty strong, to be honest. You get a pretty decent chunk of change in terms of your development. In terms of reforms as well, I mean, you don't get much, but Paradox is a Swedish company, so Norway gets pretty cool missions, Denmark gets pretty cool missions, Sweden gets cool missions, and you get access to some pretty neat reforms, like getting dev costs down inside your forest land, which can be quite strong. Because in essence, you can dev forest like farmlands, and if you go to the new one, that's again pretty neat. So there's a lot of cool stuff to play around it. The development is good, and because there's a lot of cultures in that area, you're Sapmi, you're Danish, you're Swedish, you're Finnish, you're Norwegian, it's not that easy to accept you as well. So unlike the English, you're not held back by that. I think that the Nordic culture group is a pretty solid choice to have in B tier as well. Maybe not as good as the other Indians, or honestly as smart as the Spanish, but I think it's above the C tier tags. So yeah, Nordics pretty strong and pretty respectful. Memes aside of wanting to make fun of Swedish people, and primal urges and all that, I think they're a pretty solid culture group and definitely deserving of a relatively high status. Again, no absolute monsters like the Germans, but they're a very reliable culture group nonetheless. With that said, we move on to Native Americans again. Ottomangueese, I think Otomanguein. I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm sorry. What? You get the Zapotecs in there, you get some Mixtecs. It's relatively famous tags, actually. Namely, they're famous because they fought the Aztecs, to be honest, but again, no. Then we get the Pacific culture group. Had to Google this flag again. There's no Pacific culture group tags, at least not that I saw in the Wikipedia. I think their flag is relatively cool though, but with that said, you're not getting a lot of tags. I'm sorry. You're basically a glorified Native American at this point. You're cool. You're a cool Native American, but you're a Native American. And after the Pacific, you're getting the Panutian. That's your Chinooks and two other very small Native American culture groups. Again, Native American culture groups would actually be unironically a lot stronger if they actually had like half of the natives in America were that culture group. But they're not, so your culture group tends to be pathetic. So congrats, into F tier you go. Again, no unique real content in terms of your reforms. The only unique stuff you're getting is from your government, and it's not good. After that, we get the Plains Aboriginals. Exactly the same story. You've heard me complain about Native Americans enough in this video, I'm sure, so I'm not going to repeat myself. And after that, we move on to the Sahelian. That's your Kanem Bornus, your Jollof, your Air culture group. It's the other ones in the Songhai area, and honestly pretty comparable. Less gold mines, but a bit more bland. I don't think it's as good as the Songhai culture group, but it's not awful. You get a decent chunk of change in terms of your development, but development potential, but it's really not great. So I think it's enough to get out of F tier, but I'm not going to be putting you any higher than that. With that said, though, after the Sahelian, we get to the Siouan. That's your Sui and your other Suiks, or other, again, Native American culture groups. I'm definitely going to get a comment below these pronunciations, and I'll be completely honest with you, I deserve it. These are awful. I know they are. I mean, I would apologize, but apology implies that I'm going to change my behavior, and I'm not. I just have given up on trying to pronounce these guys, the Native Americans. You're just going into F tier. You get the drill at this point. And after that, we get the Sonoran. Great. I mean, a bit more Mexican in terms of your Native Americans, but yeah, into F tier we go. Christ, F tier is quite substantial at this point. But yeah, that's just how many Native American culture groups there are. There are so many. Next, we get South African. Mutapa's got some cool stuff. Most of the time when you're playing this culture group, you're playing Mutapan. They also believe the Zulu are inside this domain as well, so it's got that going for it. But honestly, it's very much carried by the fact that there's a lot of gold in this area, and there's a lot of ivory and good trade goods, and you have access to Zanzibar early. They're definitely nicer than something like the Celtics, and simply because of the relative uniqueness of something like the Mutapa governments you get access to, but not by much. I think the honest answer is they very barely squeeze themselves into D tier, but I can't put them higher than that. I don't think gold in Africa is worth making up for the fact that you are playing in South Africa, to be honest. It's a very hard place to get institutions in the world, and there's not enough unique things to make up for it. And again, you do have to work for the buffs you do get. You have to conquer Zanzibar, you have to work around your debuffs from institutions. You have to go ahead and actually get the Zulu to get their relatively unique military buffs. After that, we get the South Slavic culture group. Surprisingly high dev. Albania, Bosnia, Bulgaria, Croatia, Serbia, and Sicily actually get a decent chunk of development with them. Especially in that culture group. You do get absorbed into the Slavic culture group if someone plays Russia as well, which, most of the time you don't really. But in terms of what you do have, it's pretty decent. Now, the problem with this area, of course, is picking what nation to represent them is, quite difficult. So instead of trying to pick like, oh, to go with the Serbians as the true South Slavs, or to go with the Croats, or etc., and starting a small bulk war in the comments, I decided to go with the people that had the best flag, the Albanians. And after all, we know that any flag that sits to the Roman Empire is a flag worth representing. With that said, I think that their potential dev is pretty good. They get a lot of nice expansion opportunities into Italy, which is nice. And if you do manage to wipe out the Ottomans, that's, you can go and accept the Greeks as well, and that's a pretty easy addition to use your extra culture group stats on for a lot of land. So grab Greek and Turkish, you get a lot of extra, land if you're playing around them. I think they're pretty decent, and a lot of their land is also carried by Kosovo. Kosovo is amazing. You get a gold mine, and late game you get a coal mine. It's a beautiful province. Again, relatively divided, but that does mean that if you are playing in that culture group, you can unify them. It's a fun challenge as well, with access to the Ottomans right on your doorstep, and there's some neat reforms you can get that are unique to them. I don't think they're that amazing, but they're definitely a cut above things like the Estonians, the Greeks, and the Moroccans. So for me, I think they just barely do scrape into the C tier. Not much beyond that, but I think that's a relatively reasonable place. With the South Slavics complete, we now move on to the Sudanese. It's not great. You get Funch, Beja, and Akoli. They're definitely one of the weaker African tags. The issue is they're incredibly weak in terms of the areas that you're in. You get, I believe, 1 gold mine from them, but if you really want about that much, just culture convert it, you're better off than spending 100 dip on accepting the whole group. Just trade companying it as most of the people if you're conquering, and if you're not trade companying it, you can, just culture convert it if you really care about it. It's a very sad culture group. Definitely one of the nicer F tiers, but yeah, I mean, I don't think it's as good as something like Jollof or the Aztecs, even. Honestly, it's a very sad culture group, the Sudanese. After that, we move on to the Thai culture group. Good dev. Good land, good dev. Yep. Unique stuff as well for Ayutthaya and a lot of the content in that area. Now, the Thai culture group, again, has a lot of unique stuff going for it and a lot of relatively powerful stuff, which I think has to be respected. But more importantly, it's also relatively high dev'd, and there's some nice monuments to pick up. It's just a very solid pick all around. I don't think it's as good as something like, again, the Indian tags, so on, but I think it sits very comfortably within C tier, just above Ethiopia, but I don't think it's good as the Hungarians or these guys. I think actually I'm going to knock the Burmese down as well. I think the Burmese are just behind the Ayutthayans, sitting in C tier. After that, we move on to the Tatars. That's your Great Hordes, your Kazans, your Crimeans, and even your Sibirs. It's a good culture group. It's a very nice culture group because, again, it's a very horde-based culture group, and horde-based culture groups are good. It's a very good potential land for you to go ahead and, conquer through. So I think that has to be respected. With that said, it's not that amazing. I don't think it's as good as something like the Italian culture group, because you do have to work for making your land good, and you are a horde, so you end up burning a lot of your own land as you reconquer it. With that said, it's also a very nice culture group to conquer into if you're playing something like Russia, because a lot of your land is very, again, ripe for development. It's steppe. Steppe is quite nice to develop, which honestly it shouldn't be. Steppe historically is not good land to build cities on, but in EU4 it just is, which is, a weird Deuteronomy, but that's a debate for a separate day. For that reason alone, I think it goes into C tier, and I think, again, that's not that much of a controversial choice. We're already filling out a lot of C tier here, but that's because I think a lot of C tier tags just ended up being at the back. With that said, after the Tatars, we move to the Tibetan culture group. It's a very sad culture group. It's working really, really hard to not be an F tier. I think because you're next to India, so once you've conquered Tibet, you can move into those other areas in terms of your conquest and positioning. It's not awful. But you don't get a lot of land, and the land that you do get is awful. You're getting basically mountainous, like glacial terrain to dev. You do get a gold mine in a glacier, so good luck deving that. It's just a very sad culture group. I don't like the Tibetan culture group. It's just honestly awful. You should really culture convert the Tibetan culture group if you ever bother with it. But the honest answer is, don't even waste your dip on it. It's not large enough to revolt to really be an issue. So, I mean, it's not as bad as the Native Americans, but it's honestly not even good as Fudge. With the Tibetan culture group done with, we move on to the Native Americans of 2P culture group. The Native American culture group. I'm not going to repeat myself. You've heard me complain about them 50 times. After that, we get the Ugric culture group. That's your Perms and the other uncolonized provinces right of Russia.
it's almost a nerf to Russia that these guys are not in their culture group. I think it's a pretty reasonable nerf to Russia. They don't get even more free land, culturally accepted. But if you're playing as them, you're playing as them as a challenge. It's pretty terrible. You get the Bashkrit gold mine. That's nice. But realistically, what just happens is your culture group gets accepted for the gold mine, and that's about it. Not much more to say there. I mean, you're working really hard to not sit in F tier, but I think F tier is really oversubscribed, and saying that Perm is as bad as, a gold mine in Europe technically is as bad as some Native American tribe is an insult to Perm. So I think bottom of E tier is where you belong, but I'm not going to be putting you any higher than that. With that said, we move on to the West Africans. That's your Dahomis, your Dagbon and Ashanti. It's a kind of same story as Songhai and Mutapa, I think. Pretty much the same things to be said about that. It's relatively unique, some nice stuff, but not that much. I think that's a reasonable placement, but I'm not going to be... It's pretty bottom D tier as well. That's the West Africans. Now we move to the Western Aryans. This is the other Indian tech group. Very similar things to say about the other Indians. Honestly, yeah, that's Gujarat. That's that kind of things. Relatively unique government reforms. Relatively unique content. Cannot complain too much. Solid group. Solid trade goods. Solid land to dev. Solid starting land. Very decent culture group. Not much more to say there. And after that, we finally get to the West Slavics. Another victim of Russia gameplay that can absorb you into this absolutely massive, over-the-top culture group that is obscene and all over the shop. But Western Slavic, I think, makes up for it for being just incredibly good to dev. You get Bohemia. Bohemia is great to dev. A lot of it is farmland, and the bits of it that aren't farmland, your hills, are Silesia, which is coal and iron, so it's great trade goods. Poland is incredible to dev. You get loads of farmlands, loads of grassland. Poland is beautiful to dev. Basically, a dev campaign as Poland is something you should definitely try if you haven't already. Just ignoring all the other Poland things that make Poland strong, like your Wind Hussars and your mini cavalry lark. Just the development potentials of Poland is insane. So yeah, even though it's not that many tanks you're accepting, it is still 5 cultures, and I think that's pretty good. For that reason, I think it's going to go near the top of C tier. It definitely edges out the Hungarians, but I don't think it quite makes its way to something like the English culture groups in terms of their raw deving potential. But yeah, I mean, it's very comparable. I can see the argument for putting it to B tier, to be honest, as well. Like, I would accept this as a valid answer to the tier list as well. It definitely sits quite nicely there, but I think this makes a bit more sense for me mentally. You still have to work quite a bit for Poland, and the thing is with Poland is, it's compared to something like Scandinavia, Poland is a lot more invadable and a lot less defensible than something like England or Scandinavia or even the Italians. But that is going to conclude the tier list, so I hope you enjoyed watching. So with that, thank you very much for making it to the end. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.